Hello, my name is Michael Todran, and I am today's host of the Landscape Architecture Podcast. And today's guest is Kate Orff.
Hi.
Sometimes it is difficult to distinguish whether new outlets are portraying the current state of New York through an objective lens or a sensational one. Can you offer us an insight view of New York right now?
Yes, so just to give you a little context here, I am sitting in my study in Queens, New York during the COVID-19 pandemic. And so, I mean, I guess the view on the ground in New York is grim in the sense that at this point, probably we've all had a relative or a coworker or a colleague who either has the virus or has perished from the virus. So it is sort of a grim situation right now on the ground. Nevertheless, I do feel like all of the social distancing efforts are succeeding. So in a way, we have our Governor Andrew Cuomo is giving us daily PowerPoints and describing the kind of data that's available on COVID. I think the other thing that's been clear to everyone in this sort of impact zone is that the data is only, data is just relative to the situation and the number of tests available. I do feel like what we've seen is that many of our friends and colleagues basically potentially have had the virus in some case, or symptoms directly in parallel with the COVID, but had never even gotten a test. So I do feel like it is a great lesson in the strengths and limitations of data. Data is what you can count, and unfortunately, we haven't really even been able to count all of the cases. So I think we're feeling both sober, but also optimistic relative to the trend of flattening the curve.
And how are you? How is your family? How's your general well-being right now?
I will say that our family was impacted. My husband's parents both had a positive COVID test and were both are in the age of concern, and both have underlying conditions that made it quite a risk. So we had quite a scare about 2 weeks ago. So my personal family is kind of through that at this point. And I would say the Scape office as a whole, we are, a very young, healthy, vibrant, dynamic office. And I do feel like what is more difficult to describe is more of like the personal or the emotional toll. We have a lot of single people. We have a really strong LGBTQ community. We have just, we have, individuals working in isolation in their apartments, and beyond the actual health challenges, there's just emotional well-being challenge that I think most everyone is experiencing. But I think some people, particularly living alone, whether you're any age, it is obviously very difficult. But in general, we're okay.
Okay, thank you for sharing that. In 2019, Walter Hood was the second landscape architect to receive the MacArthur Fellow, you being the first in 2017. Part one of my question is, did having a second landscape architect relieve any social tensions or awkwardness now that you are no longer the only recipient? Was that like a relief?
I was thrilled for Walter. I've known Walter for over 20 years. So, and we correspond and are involved in competitions as rivals and as friends, and in the academic world, et cetera. We've lectured at each other's universities and basically have an extremely kind of professional and cordial and very positive and encouraging relationship. So regardless, I mean, I think what's funny is the presumption of tension on my part.
No.
No, I know. I'm just saying that it was a thrill, and I expect to have many more. And that was my message when I won the MacArthur Fellowship, was like, get ready, because this is the first of a long line of landscape architects to be awarded this fellowship, because this is the profession that is transformational relative to a creative, dynamic, forward-looking approach to integrating environment, design, and human action. So I was like, get your pens out, because there's going to be a long line of landscape architects coming for this award. So it was a thrill, and to get it, and I think I was like the second person to send Walter a high five when the award was announced. It's just so awesome for landscape.
That's awesome. And just to be clear, my angle was in regards to, I felt like if I was the only recipient, I would be happy that there was a second one to take the pressure off of like being in a room and being like, there she is. And now it's like, no.
I do remember.
That's the angle I was going for.
Totally. The ASLA conference right after the fellowship was announced. I remember being like, but then also just super, super excited to kind of feel like I'm a sort of ambassador to this larger community. And, just a kind of a funny note on the MacArthur. I mean, one thing that felt fantastic was that I went to an event with MacArthur Fellows from my year and then 5 years prior. And what the foundation essentially paired individuals, not really knowing us as people, but knowing our work. And the pairings were absolutely fantastic and interesting. And they kind of built up, and there was so much about the methods that were shared. I was paired with a person who has kind of reinvented the opera. And who has been directing kind of participatory operas in Los Angeles and other places. And so even though we're working in very different with very different means and very different materials, there were so many threads that kind of pulled the whole day together. It made me feel really positive and just I think the sort of landscape approach that that was being discussed just kind of was pulling together and kind of synthesizing a lot of threads for the whole day. So excellent. Me feel really good about the profession and how we're sort of right in there.
Can you tell us if Scape Studio was able to apply any of the grant towards research, and if so, can you tell us about that research?
Yeah, so in a funny way, the grant is sort of given out over many, many years. It's not like you get a check and then you pay the taxes into the bank. It's sort of something that comes over the years. But what's funny is that regardless of the fellowship, I've always kind of prioritized research, or maybe it's almost too expansive to call it research. I would just say work, work that doesn't necessarily have a client or a program or a fee. And this goes back to, the early days when I did the bird safe building design guidelines for U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, with the envisioning gateway and the kind of this kind of research around national parks and urban national parks from which this kind of book on Gateway National Park and Jamaica Bay and the research around the Jamaica Bay emerged from Safari 7. Safari 7 was a project of the Urban Landscape Lab at Columbia that really wasn't what I would call an unfunded research project, but nevertheless, I did it with my two colleagues, Jeanette and Glenn, just because we felt like it was something that needed to be done. So, and same thing with oyster texture. Oyster texture was in 2009 with a very modest stipend from the Museum of Modern Art, and I invested quite a bit in much beyond the scope of that very modest fee to sort of spark and pour sort of like jet fuel on a lot of research that we had already been doing and thinking that we had already been doing about ecological infrastructure and the kind of future of New York Harbor. Petrochemical America was also something that I put on my credit card. So I would just say how I have seen it is like, to me, the MacArthur wasn't like, oh, all of a sudden I was doing this and now I'm doing that. It's sort of just like intensifying or kind of turning up the volume a little bit on the way that that we've been working for many years. And of course, it's just a tremendous boost. And I really saw it as a kind of a keep going in caps, rather than like, oh God, now what do I have to do now? It was like, I just kept writing on my notebook, like keep going, and then underline.
Oh,
so
great.
That's sort of how I sort of process that time and that award.
Seems like a very timely motivational 2 words for us right now.
Yeah.
Our current state of global quarantine has offered opportunities to exercise introspection with self, community, business, and the world. I'm curious if you have had any moments of self-reflection on any of those scales, and if so, are you willing to share it with us?
So say that again, the beginning part, self-reflection.
Self-reflection. So basically, this quarantine has offered us a moment of self-reflection, kind of slowing things down. And I imagine that you would have some self-reflection in business, in the world.
Yes.
Can you share any of that with us?
Yeah. I mean, I suppose the human tragedy is apparent with COVID-19, and I sort of described that at the beginning of our conversation. So just knowing and being mindful of the human tragedy unfolding before us is something that's very clear. I do feel like what has emerged is, for me personally, I guess, in terms of reflections, is just the power of time. And I am somebody, probably like many others who you interview on your podcast, in sort of pre-COVID times, I might be on a plane 2 times a week, going to visit our job sites or interacting with our clients. And my grandmother, who is a Midwestern grandmother from Iowa, used to say to me, "Oh, Kate, you'll meet yourself coming and going," which is like just the second that you're walking out the door, you're kind of like, "Hello," and then you. So it's a very Midwestern way of saying like you're sort of not reflecting, or you're on the go too much. And I do feel like that this time for me has been particularly meaningful because I have 2 children, I have a husband, have a garden that needs caring for, and so rather than sort of jumping on this notion of like, okay, I have to go fabricate 1,000 masks or personal protective equipment, all these things that are definitely dire and in need, I have sort of kind of taken a turn toward reflection, slowing down, care and maintenance of the people in my immediate environs, and also the landscape in my immediate environs. So I've been on a kind of, I live near Forest Park in Queens, which is a large but very, very neglected park, which is overrun by, you could name them Oriental bittersweet, knotweed, ailanthus, it's literally like all of these series of invasive species. So and ivy. So in my sort of time where I need to get out, I used to be quite athletic and play Division I lacrosse, but those days are over. I'm more like taking walks now.
You played D1 lacrosse?
I played D1 lacrosse.
Nice.
At the University of Virginia, right?
That's awesome. That's why you're such a badass.
It's like getting in there. I do feel like there's some correlation that somebody needs to study around women athletes and leaders, business leaders. That's very clear. Like Susan Rice is one of my heroes. She's like a basketball team player. And I don't know, I've just noticed that every, women that I admire, all of a sudden I'm like, oh, you are a rower. Okay. So there's usually some kind of a connection there. So all that is to say that my sort of moments of reflection have been on slowing down and trying to like literally focus on what's right in front of me. And that has to do with like, and this sounds like an incredibly rote and banal thing, but I walk down the street, Union Turnpike, and I pick up trash and I weed and I do kind of like just try to take care of things around me. So, and I do feel like that is this kind of challenge that pre-COVID, we all are just going at the speed of sound and participating in any matter of conferences, which are important to sort of develop a collegial and professional dialogue, et cetera. But, you really look back on kind of discussions, even within landscape architecture, that just seem so, not relevant now that there's so much more at stake in the global environment relative to the climate emergency and relative to now this pandemic and so on. It's just makes you really reflect on your own personal life and also reflect on how we could probably work even harder together as a profession through our organizations like the Landscape Architecture Foundation and ASLA and other groups to sort of try to, there's no universal agreement on anything, but I do feel like there are priorities and knowledge that landscape architects could consolidate around and kind of create a much more unified front around relative to advocating for change and relative to kind of positioning ourselves as this, very positive force.
What does Greta Thunberg represent to you?
So Greta Thunberg represents someone who is not taking it anymore. I do feel like landscape architecture is implicated in this. All of us, we are implicated in this discussion because in a way, and I've written essays on this and so on, but in a way, our profession has to some degree served to facilitate a carbon intensive economy, right? We are working alongside carbon infrastructure and we are developing and through our commissions, large suburban tracts. We are decorating highways, and so I do feel like what Greta stands for is somebody who's just saying, just stop doing that, stop. And I think it's very difficult to be trying to run forward and then stopping at the same time. So I think probably every practitioner of landscape, every graduate of a landscape architecture program is grappling with a similar thing, which is, how do you both exist and persist as part of a society, as an active player in a society, while actively trying to make radical change that's in the society at the same time. So, but we're so implicated. We use nitrogen fertilizer to make our grasses green. We use, probably exploited labor to clip these hedges that you see in these like gorgeous black and white imagery of very highly designed landscapes. We, we use plastic in our play equipment. There's just layers and layers of petrochemical and carbon intensity in landscape. And so that for me is something was a sort of clarion call, like Greta's really sort of standing up and trying to just say that you cannot change the system while working within the system at the same time. And I admire that. Yeah.
That seems better. If not, I could try to fix it in post, but overall it's great. Okay. On our social media, we reached out to the landscape architecture community and asked what our followers would like to ask you. The following question best represents the majority of inquiries received. And that's basically is how can we as landscape architects advocate more ecology-based solutions for non-government clients? So how do we advocate
Right. Well, so I think one aspect of that response to me is I never separate ecology out from design. I never say like, here's the thing, and then over here is this ecological meadow restoration. I always describe everything that we do very holistically in terms of the human experience and the need for texture. And that somehow, this is one of these sort of false debates that I feel like is totally not useful for landscape architecture, which is that to some might say, oh, well, you know, you're making design a dirty word, you know, or like somehow that you're positioning, you know, design as some kind of a top-down sort of elite thing for the masses. And that is definitely not anything that I am trying to do or that anyone else, I believe, is trying to do. For me, a robust ecological landscape is the product of intensive design and is an incredibly aesthetic and holistic and intuitive experience. So, for example, we have a 5-acre park that we're designing in San Francisco on the water called China Basin Park. And we have a developer client and a whole series of state and city agencies that we answer to relative to our work and regulatory contexts and review contexts. And so in this park, I developed a series of what we're calling kind of tidal shelves that step down, that literally kind of eat into or take part of the park and reorient the park out toward the bay landscape and the horizon. And throughout the process, I've never talked about it like, here's the park over here and here's the ecology part. It's literally one coherent sort of integrated experiential process that sort of unfolds. So just as these tidal shelves, I would say, are incredibly ecologically motivated in the sense that they recruit and are designed for specific species in the intertidal landscape, that we've designed this incredibly beautiful flushing action that sort of puts the water on display, if you will, as almost like a work of art. I've never sort of put it to the side and said to our clients in the San Francisco Giants, like a ball club that's deeply interested in recreation. I've never said like, here's the recreation part and here's the ecology part. It's sort of like, this is a highly recreational experience. It is a learning opportunity. It is an after-school programming context. It is a way for people to get down and begin to interact with the water. It is going to be a destination which is unique, and so on. So I would just say it's a little bit of an extra price tag, but I truly try not to bifurcate design and ecology in everything that we do. And you know, I advocate for it from an experiential standpoint. And this is something I wrote maybe like in 2005. I wrote this piece called Beyond Landscape, and it was really about, you know, this aesthetic, you know, the eyes that we bring when we bring to landscape architecture, and when we're very focused on photography in capturing our work. And I've been trying to just not be focused on photography to capture our work. I've been trying to kind of, you know, explore other means. But photography kind of flattens the view and makes it more pictorial and composed. But the reality is, I think we experience the world through texture and touch and smell and all of these other things that have nothing to do with a photograph. So all of those aspects, and I think the larger frame of what we do, which is, how can you even kind of discuss color and texture and an aesthetic kind of lens with empty skies, skies empty of migratory birds or water bodies devoid of fish and marine mammals. I mean, it's almost impossible to imagine even discussing an aesthetic of landscape in in a world that is being largely biologically annihilated. So I feel like that's just, for me, part of the discussion and part of where we need to go. So there's not like design happens over here and that's like Illustrator, a lot of Illustrator diagrams, and then sort of ecology happens over here, and that has to do with like hard work and specifications and soil, and they're just the same thing. They're just totally the same thing. And I think most clients, I would say, when they hire landscape architects, are really wanting to have that experience. They're not wanting an exterior version of an architectural thought process. We have a very landscape-driven and ecologically driven thought process that finds its way into the work.
I feel like that approach of, if I may, embrace and expose and unify ecology and design. I feel like that could go on all scales, from residential all the way up to the largest public works. Mm-hmm. It's a matter of framing it and like you said, not bifurcating it and mm-hmm. just being like, this is it. This is the piece.
Yeah.
Agree. When restrictions begin to ease, how can our profession avoid making decisions in haste in an attempt to regain some sense of normalcy?
Yeah, I mean, I do feel like we will all be discovering what normalcy is, and personally, I've learned a lot from being in this situation, and I hope to kind of apply it to the future. I think the other thing that's clear is that there are going to be big tranches coming from the federal government to sort of bail out the airlines, to bail out the cruise industry, to bail out and what I think is critical is for landscape architects to work together and begin to advocate for, during this time, of a reinvestment in kind of climate ready future, and to think about these investments as a kind of a form of not only COVID response, but sort of proactive climate response. And we just have to, I mean, my own personal carbon footprint, I know, is drastically reduced because I'm just walking in a 5-block radius from my abode, and not flying. And there is so much that you can do virtually through, and so lectures that I had signed up to do in London and other places, I'm obviously just going to be using this format as we're talking today. And so there's just so much that we can do to sort of carry this forward, and not just assume that normal is our carbon intensive economics of normal, because we will really have missed this opportunity. I mean, there are examples in some cities, I guess Boston and other cities, where literally streets have been closed in order to enable social distancing. And you think, like, do I really need to make that one car trip to get this one thing from fill in the blank, Home Depot or whatever? And we're all consolidating trips. We're all traveling only when it's needed. So I can only imagine that being like an incredibly positive and forward-looking discussion and way of returning to a non-normal. And just an absolutely critical things have been learned too during this period around air quality. For example, the Financial Times reported that and did a sort of a depiction of air quality this time last year and this time this year. It's like very, very dramatic reduction in CO2 emissions. And so in a funny way, this is what Greta has been calling for, which is a stop doing what you're doing and try to do something different. And we've all stopped, not out of our, belief in the climate emergency, but out of a sense of each individual person, out of their own sense of mortality and fear for this virus. So, as strange as that is, as it may seem, we have to construct a new normal that is more carbon, more is decarbonized, a decarbonized normal, and something I think also that reflects this ethos of care that I had kind of, and maintenance that I had mentioned earlier. There's a great book, for people listening, there's a great book by Juliet Schor, Schor. She's a sociologist in Massachusetts, and it's called Plenitude. And it's I reread the book, but it's about kind of, she's an economist, or she's kind of describing the economy around time and rich, poor, and how time is really the great luxury. So in a funny way, I felt like that book Plenitude is so relevant to now, because we see social inequity, the poorest who are in service-based economy needing to go to work, putting themselves at risk and to maintain their paycheck. And, I think somehow we have to restructure our tax structure and our economic structure to simply enable this luxury of time for people across the income spectrum and the social spectrum.
Would you ever be interested in writing any kind of papers or research in regards to business methodologies for landscape architects, and how maybe using your firm and as an example of how you've been able to go after the work that you want and survive?
We have an amazing set of principals. One of our principals, Alexis Landis, is our managing principal, and she's done a few ASLA panels on business strategy. I mean, I feel like in a way, as a sort of a leader, I've really tried to have a strategy of empowerment of people. So that is my business strategy, is like find and empower amazing people across the board. And Alexis has really been key in kind of applying certain super intelligence to how that translates into a sort of a very, very granular and grounded business strategy. So I don't know if I think there are other firms out there who kind of leave us in the dust over and over again in terms of getting projects, and but I do feel like in a funny way it is something that one is rarely trained for, but I actually love the business aspect of what we do in kind of an unexpected way, because for me it's just about strategy and planning and thinking ahead. And I mentioned I was a lacrosse player, but I was a lacrosse coach too for girls, and when I was in high school. And so I feel like all of those same things are still at play, which is like trying to like get the best people in the best position to do their best at that moment. And that is like my business strategy.
What position did you play in lacrosse?
I was center.
Center. Wow. Okay. Cool. That makes a lot of sense as a metaphor, that position. I assume that the center position is similar to a center position in basketball.
Right, you start the tip off and you kind of direct the ball, and you try to you transition between offense and defense.
Sure, and you're kind of the natural leader of the team, or the de facto leader, yeah. So yeah, that all makes sense. Well, thank you very much for your time. It's greatly
Thank you.
appreciated. There's many
It's
people.
a nice format. It enables a little bit more time than the normal Q&A, which is great. Thank you.